There's a level of mental control that makes defeat impossible in any situation. And a masterless samurai who survived over 60 death matches without losing once proved exactly how it works. Some people remain perfectly effective when everything around them falls apart. They don't freeze under pressure. They don't react to provocation. They don't collapse when circumstances turn hostile. While everyone else loses effectiveness the moment conditions change, these people maintain complete internal stability. And you know what most people assume? They're naturally strong. They're built differently. Their psychology works in ways mine doesn't. But records from feudal Japan tell a different story. Your effectiveness doesn't collapse because you lack skill. It collapses because external conditions disturb your internal state, and you allow it. Miyamoto Musashi understood this in its most extreme form. Born in 1584, orphaned young, socially marginal, he faced a brutal reality. If his mind was disturbed for even 1 second during combat, he would die. So across more than 60 life or death duels, he trained himself to remain internally unmoved. His opponents reacted. He did not. That asymmetry made him untouchable. And before he withdrew from combat entirely, he codified the mental discipline that kept him alive into a single foundational principle. He called it his first rule. Do not allow your mind to be disturbed by external conditions. Once you understand how he enforced this rule, you'll see why invulnerability has nothing to do with dominance and everything to do with immunity to disturbance. But there's something most people refuse to accept about this kind of control. It requires treating your internal reactions as separate from your decisions. Not something you are, but something you govern. Before I show you exactly how Musashi developed this discipline, subscribe to the channel, like the video below, and comment on what disturbs your effectiveness most: pressure, insults, chaos, or uncertainty. This helps the channel reach more people, and I read every response. Now let's begin. The world Miyamoto Musashi was born into in 1584 didn't reward emotional expression. It punished it with death. Late Sengoku period Japan was collapsing. Civil wars raged across provinces. Loyalties shifted overnight. Samurai who served powerful lords one season found themselves masterless and hunted the next. This wasn't a romantic age of honor duels and noble warriors. This was systematic, unrelenting violence where hesitation, anger, or fear didn't make you human. It made you a corpse. In this environment, emotional regulation wasn't philosophy. It was survival technology. And Musashi was born into the worst possible position within it. Orphaned early, no family protection, no access to elite sword schools, physically unremarkable by samurai standards. Everything about his starting position suggested he wouldn't survive, let alone dominate. But he did survive. And the question that defines his entire life is this: how does someone with no advantages, no formal training, and no social power become untouchable in a world designed to destroy him? The answer didn't come from strength. It came from a realization he made the first time he killed someone. He was 13 years old. Chapter 2. The first lesson: when hesitation becomes permanent. Most origin stories begin with a moment of triumph. Musashi's began with irreversible violence he barely understood. Raised in a village called Miyamoto, he had no stable guardian after his father disappeared from his life. Some records suggest his father was a sword instructor who abandoned him. Others claim he died in combat. What's certain is this: Musashi grew up without protection in a society structured entirely around hierarchy and patronage. No family name meant no social standing. No standing meant no formal training. No training meant no path to legitimacy. He was exposed to the mechanics of violence early, not as a student, but as a witness. Feudal Japan didn't hide death from children. Executions were public, duels were frequent. Disputes ended with blades. By the time Musashi was old enough to hold a sword, he'd already seen what happened when men hesitated. They died slowly, or they died quickly. But they died. And at 13 years old, someone challenged him. The details are sparse. Historical accounts don't romanticize it. There's no record of honorable buildup or philosophical reflection. A man named Arima Kihei, a trained swordsman from a legitimate school, either provoked Musashi or accepted a challenge from him. The reasons don't survive in the records. What survives is the outcome. Musashi killed him, not elegantly, not with refined technique. The fight was chaotic, desperate, and brutal. And when it ended, Musashi was standing over a body he'd created. This is where most retellings insert transformation. The moment the boy becomes a warrior, the moment confidence is born. But that's not what happened. Musashi didn't feel powerful. He felt the weight of permanence. The man was dead. That state wouldn't reverse. No apology would undo it. No regret would change it. And in that moment, Musashi learned something that would define every decision he made for the rest of his life. The world does not pause for your emotions. Fear didn't stop the fight. Confusion didn't slow time. Hesitation didn't create space for better options. His internal state, whatever he was feeling, was completely irrelevant to the outcome. The only thing that mattered was whether he acted or froze. And freezing, he now understood, was identical to dying. This realization didn't make him braver. It made him aware of a separation most people never notice. There was what he felt: fear, confusion, adrenaline, shock. And there was what he did: move, strike, survive. Those two things were connected, but they weren't the same. Feeling fear was automatic. Obeying fear was a choice. And every time he obeyed an emotion instead of a decision, he handed control to something outside himself. In a duel, that meant death. Musashi began training himself to notice the gap between sensation and action. When fear appeared, he didn't try to eliminate it. He stopped letting it dictate his movements. When doubt emerged, he didn't argue with it. He acted anyway. This wasn't confidence. Confidence implies certainty, and Musashi had none. This was control, the deliberate enforcement of decision over reaction. And it had to be enforced constantly because his nervous system didn't care about his intentions. It responded to threat automatically. It generated panic, freezing, second-guessing. Musashi's innovation wasn't eliminating those responses. It was refusing to obey them. Most fighters trained their technique. Musashi began training his relationship to his own internal experience. He noticed that when his mind was disturbed, when anger flared, when insult landed, when circumstances shifted, his effectiveness collapsed instantly. Not because he lacked skill, but because disturbance displaced his capacity to execute. So he started building a mental discipline that would later become his first rule. Do not allow external conditions to disturb your internal state. At 13, he couldn't articulate it that clearly, but he'd learned the cost of losing internal control. And he discovered that survival didn't belong to the talented, the trained, or the confident. It belonged to the undisturbed. Musashi didn't become a legend that day. He became someone who understood that the mind, left undisciplined, would betray him faster than any opponent ever could. And that understanding, brutal, unsentimental, earned through irreversible consequence, became the foundation of everything that followed. He would fight over 60 more duels in his lifetime. He would never lose, not because he was unbeatable, but because he trained himself to remain internally unmoved while everyone else collapsed under the weight of their own reactions. The lesson was simple, and it was permanent. Disturbance equals defeat. Everything else was just technique. Chapter 3. Musashi's First Rule. Defined decades after his first kill, Musashi wrote the Book of Five Rings in a cave on Mount Iwato. He was 60 years old, withdrawn from combat, living in isolation. And in that text, he codified the discipline that kept him alive. Do not let your spirit be influenced by others. Modern readers misunderstand this completely. They read spirit and think soul. They read influenced and think persuaded. They assume Musashi is teaching emotional tranquility, some Zen-like state of inner peace. He isn't. Musashi is giving tactical instruction for maintaining operational control under pressure. The Japanese term he uses is kokoro, often translated as spirit or heart-mind. But kokoro in martial context doesn't mean your emotional center. It means your capacity to Decide and execute without interference. When Musashi says, "Do not let your spirit be influenced," he means, do not allow external conditions to control your internal decision-making process. The word influenced here is closer to displaced or hijacked. Musashi isn't saying don't feel emotions. He's saying don't let emotions make your decisions for you. This distinction is critical because most people confuse suppression with discipline. Suppression means forcing emotions down, pretending they don't exist, numbing yourself. Discipline means observing emotions without obeying them. Musashi felt fear. He felt anger. He felt insult and hunger and exhaustion. But those sensations didn't determine his actions, because the moment they did, he lost. Here's what disturbance meant in operational terms for Musashi: being pulled off your timing. In combat, timing is survival. If an opponent can make you rush, hesitate, or break rhythm, they control the engagement. Insults disturb timing. Provocations disturb timing. Even compliments disturb timing. Any emotional reaction that shifts your internal tempo hands advantage to whoever triggered it, being baited into reaction. Most fighters revealed their strategy through emotional tells. Anger made them aggressive. Fear made them defensive. Pride made them predictable. Musashi trained himself to give no tells, and more importantly, to take no bait. If an opponent tried to provoke him, the provocation landed on nothing. No anger to manipulate, no pride to exploit, allowing others to set your internal state. This is the core of the rule. Most people's internal state is a reaction to external conditions. Someone insults them, they become angry. Someone praises them, they become confident. Circumstances deteriorate, they become anxious. Their emotional experience is caused by the outside world. Musashi reversed this. His internal state was set by his decisions, not by circumstances. This created a mental hierarchy that governed everything he did. Observation above emotion. Notice what's happening without letting it trigger automatic reactions. Decision above impulse. Choose the action based on strategy, not feeling. Action without internal debate. Execute immediately without negotiating with your own resistance. This hierarchy worked far beyond duels. When Musashi traveled Japan as a wandering swordsman, he had no money, no status, no comfort. He slept outside, went hungry for days, was rejected by established sword schools who saw him as crude and unrefined. Any of these conditions could have disturbed him, made him desperate, resentful, or reactive. Instead, he observed them, decided how to respond, and acted. Poverty didn't make him compromise his principles for patronage. Rejection didn't make him prove himself through reckless challenges. Discomfort didn't make him abandon his training, because none of those external conditions had permission to set his internal state. When elite schools dismissed him as unpolished, it didn't injure his self-image. He simply noted the information and continued. When political powers ignored him, it didn't create desperate status-seeking behavior. He remained operationally focused. This is where most people fail to understand what Musashi built. They think undisturbed means emotionless. It doesn't. It means ungoverned by external triggers. Musashi wasn't teaching stoic detachment or philosophical acceptance. He was teaching tactical independence. The fighter who controls his own internal state cannot be manipulated. The fighter who must be provoked, flattered, or frightened to change behavior is already defeated. He just doesn't know it yet. Musashi's first rule isn't moral philosophy. It's not about being a good person or finding inner peace. It's operational doctrine. Your effectiveness is only as stable as your internal state, and your internal state is only as stable as your discipline in refusing external control. This rule made Musashi untouchable not because it made him stronger, faster, or more skilled than his opponents. It made him untouchable because while they were fighting him, they were also fighting their own disturbance. Anger at his disrespect, frustration at his unconventional tactics, impatience with his timing. Musashi fought only his opponent. They fought two battles simultaneously, and no one wins a two-front war. That's what "do not let your spirit be influenced" actually means. Not transcendence, operational superiority through internal sovereignty. Chapter 4. The Untouchable Advantage. Dueling in feudal Japan wasn't private, it was theater. Samurai fought in front of crowds. Reputations were built or destroyed based on performance. A single loss could end a fighter's career, strip their credibility, and eliminate any chance of patronage. The pressure wasn't just physical, it was social, financial, and existential. And that pressure created vulnerability. Because when reputation is at stake, fighters don't just execute technique. They perform for an audience. They posture. They demonstrate confidence. They respond to insults to protect honor. Every one of those behaviors is a disturbance, and Musashi exploited disturbance like a weapon. While other fighters played the social game, arriving on time, bowing formally, exchanging ritualistic words, Musashi refused to participate. He broke rules deliberately. He dressed poorly when opponents expected martial elegance. He used unconventional weapons when tradition demanded katana. He arrived late when punctuality signaled respect. To observers, this looked like arrogance or disrespect. In reality, it was tactical, because every broken expectation created emotional reaction in his opponent. And emotional reaction created disturbance, and disturbance destroyed timing. Musashi's behavioral pattern across dozens of duels was consistent. Refused to meet emotional provocations. When opponents insulted him, he didn't respond. When they postured, he remained silent. When they tried to dominate the pre-fight interaction, he gave them nothing to work with. Violate social expectations deliberately. Show up late. Use a wooden sword against steel. Fight in unconventional stances. Anything that created confusion or frustration in the opponent. Remain internally unmoved while the opponent destabilized. Watch them grow angry, impatient, or anxious, and maintain perfect operational calm. The pattern reached its clearest expression in 1612 on Ganryu Island. Musashi was 29 years old. His opponent was Sasaki Kojiro, one of the most celebrated swordsmen in Japan. Kojiro was everything Musashi wasn't. Formally trained under elite masters, refined technique, employed by a powerful lord, known for a signature move called Tsubame Gaishi, the swallow's return strike, executed with a blade longer than standard katana. He was elegant, precise, and socially respected, and he was confident he would win. The duel was scheduled for 8 a.m. on a small island. Witnesses gathered. Kojiro arrived early, prepared, dressed in formal attire. Musashi didn't show up. 1 hour passed, then 2. Kojiro waited. His composure began to fracture. Records suggest he started pacing. His students noticed tension in his posture. The crowd murmured about disrespect. By the time Musashi finally arrived, hours late, Kojiro was furious. Musashi stepped off the boat holding a wooden sword he'd carved from an oar during the journey. Kojiro saw this and his anger intensified. A wooden weapon against his masterwork steel blade wasn't just unconventional, it was insulting. He shouted at Musashi, demanded to know why he was late. Musashi said nothing. Kojiro drew his blade and threw the scabbard aside, a gesture that meant he intended to kill, not merely wound. That gesture revealed everything. Kojiro's internal state was no longer under his control. Anger had displaced his discipline, impatience had disrupted his timing. The duel began. Kojiro attacked with his signature technique, the move he'd practiced for years, the strike that had made him famous. Musashi countered with the wooden sword. The fight lasted seconds. Musashi's strike connected with Kojiro's skull. Kojiro collapsed. He died on the beach without recovering consciousness. Here's what actually happened in that duel. Musashi didn't outfight Kojiro. He didn't have superior technique or physical advantage. He removed Kojiro's internal stability before the fight even began. By arriving late, Musashi created disturbance. Kojiro's anger broke his timing. His impatience made him predictable. His need to punish the disrespect overrode his tactical judgment. Kojiro was fighting two opponents, Musashi and his own destabilized emotional state. Musashi was fighting only Kojiro. That asymmetry decided the outcome before swords moved, and this wasn't a one-time trick. Musashi repeated variations of this pattern across his entire dueling career. Over 60 recorded matches, 0 losses. Not because he had a secret technique, because he had a repeatable internal process. Remain undisturbed while creating disturbance in the opponent. The strategy worked because it wasn't dependent on the opponent's specific style, weapon, or training. It targeted something universal, the instability that emerges when external conditions hijack internal state. Every fighter feels pressure. Every fighter experiences provocation. The difference is whether they obey those feelings. Kojiro obeyed his anger. His anger dictated his timing, his aggression, his judgment. Musashi felt whatever he felt and acted according to strategy anyway. This is what untouchable meant in practical terms. Not unbeatable. Musashi could have been killed by a lucky strike, an ambush, or simple miscalculation, but unmovable. Insults didn't move him. Provocations didn't move him. Reputation pressure didn't move him. Social expectations didn't move him. His internal state remained under his governance, not under external control. And in combat, that made him unreachable. Because the fighter who can't be provoked can't be baited. The fighter who can't be rushed can't be pulled off timing. The fighter whose decisions aren't governed by emotion can't be manipulated through emotional triggers. Kojiro was technically brilliant, but his effectiveness depended on internal stability, and Musashi knew exactly how to remove it. That's the untouchable advantage. Not strength, not speed, not even skill. Psychological asymmetry. While everyone else fought with divided attention, half on the opponent, half on managing their own internal reactions, Musashi fought with singular focus. And singular focus, maintained through disciplined refusal to be disturbed, proved more lethal than any technique. Chapter 5. The Cost of Being Untouchable. Musashi never lost a duel, but he lost almost everything else. The same discipline that made him operationally untouchable made him socially impossible. Because the mindset that keeps you undisturbed in combat doesn't translate well to normal human interaction. And Musashi paid for that disconnect his entire life. Start with the most obvious cost: rejection by established institutions. Elite sword schools in feudal Japan weren't just training facilities. They were networks of patronage, social legitimacy, and financial stability. Entry required more than skill. It required conformity to ritual, deference to hierarchy, and adherence to social performance. Musashi had none of that. He refused formal etiquette. He ignored rank-based deference. He wouldn't perform the elaborate social choreography that signaled respect for tradition. To schoolmasters, this wasn't strength. It was dysfunction. They saw someone who couldn't regulate himself appropriately, who couldn't modulate his behavior based on social context, who treated every interaction with the same detached operational focus he used in duels. So they rejected him, repeatedly. The Yagyu Shinkaje Ryu, one of the most prestigious schools, wouldn't accept him. The Ito Ryu considered him too crude. Even smaller schools found him incompatible with their culture. Musashi remained masterless his entire dueling career. No official position, no guaranteed income, no institutional backing. He wandered Japan as a ronin, a samurai without a lord, which was barely a step above vagrant. This wasn't romantic freedom. It was precarious survival, and it was a direct consequence of his discipline, because the same refusal to be influenced by external conditions that protected him in combat also meant he couldn't adapt to social expectations. He couldn't perform deference he didn't feel. He couldn't feign respect for hierarchy he considered operationally irrelevant. He couldn't modulate his behavior to make people comfortable. His internal state was governed by his decisions, not by social pressure. That made him untouchable in duels. It made him unemployable everywhere else. The financial consequences were severe. Records show Musashi lived in poverty for most of his life. He couldn't secure stable patronage because lords wanted more than martial skill. They wanted someone who could navigate court politics, demonstrate appropriate social grace, and represent their house with cultural refinement. Musashi couldn't do any of that. Or more precisely, he refused to train himself to do it. He'd spent decades building a discipline that prevented external conditions from influencing his internal state. He wasn't going to abandon that discipline for comfort, but the cost wasn't just social or financial. The emotional cost was profound. Musashi never married, never had children, never maintained long-term intimate relationships of any kind documented in historical records. This wasn't circumstantial. It was structural. Because intimacy requires vulnerability. It requires letting someone else affect your internal state. It requires caring what another person thinks, feels, or needs. And Musashi had trained himself for decades to not allow external conditions, including other people, to disturb him. That training created emotional austerity. He could observe his own feelings. He could recognize loneliness, isolation, the desire for connection. But he'd built a mental architecture that prevented those feelings from directing his behavior. So he remained alone. Not because he was incapable of connection, but because connection required surrendering the very discipline that kept him operationally effective. And Musashi consistently chose effectiveness over comfort. There's a letter Musashi wrote late in life where he reflects on his path. The tone is matter-of-fact, almost clinical. He doesn't express regret, but he also doesn't claim fulfillment. He describes his life the way a craftsman might describe a tool he'd built. Functional, purpose-designed, optimized for a specific task, but tools aren't happy. They're just useful. And Musashi seemed to understand he'd made himself into a tool. Here's where the story becomes complicated. Because despite, or perhaps because of, his emotional detachment, Musashi became an artist. In his later years, he produced calligraphy, ink paintings, and philosophical writings that are still studied today. His visual art has a distinct quality. Stark, minimalist, precise. No wasted strokes, no decorative flourishes. His most famous painting is a single bird on a branch, executed with maybe 7 brush strokes total. It's not warm, it's not emotionally expressive in conventional ways, but it's perfectly controlled. The same discipline he used to remain undisturbed in combat translated into artistic restraint. He could observe beauty without needing to possess it. He could create without needing validation. He could express without needing response. This raises an uncomfortable question. Did emotional non-reactivity free Musashi to create? Or did it narrow what he could create? His art is technically masterful, but it's also cold. There's no mess in it, no vulnerability, no raw emotional expression. Everything is filtered through his operational discipline. You can see the control, you can admire the precision, but you can't feel the person behind it. And that absence, that emotional distance, shows up in everything Musashi left behind. His writing is instructional, not personal. His paintings are technically brilliant, but emotionally austere. His philosophy is operationally sound, but relationally empty. He built a system that made him untouchable. But untouchable means exactly that. Unable to be touched, and unable to touch others. This isn't a moral judgment. Musashi made a conscious choice. He valued effectiveness over connection. He valued operational stability over emotional fulfillment. He valued survival over intimacy. And given his circumstances, constant warfare, death matches, social marginalization, those priorities made sense. But they came with costs he seemed to accept without illusion. In the Book of 5 Rings, Musashi writes about the warrior's path with no romantic framing. He doesn't claim it leads to happiness. He doesn't promise fulfillment. He doesn't suggest it makes you complete. He simply describes what works in combat and what doesn't. And then he offers it to anyone willing to pay the price. Because that's the reality of the mindset Musashi built. It worked, demonstrably. Over 60 duels without a loss, survival in an era where most fighters died young. But it also isolated him completely, made him socially alienated, financially unstable, emotionally austere, relationally alone. The discipline that made him operationally superior made him humanly limited. And Musashi seemed to understand that trade-off clearly. He didn't pretend his path was universal. He didn't claim everyone should live this way. He simply showed what's possible if you refuse to let external conditions govern your internal state, and what you lose when you make that refusal absolute. Untouchable doesn't mean invincible. It means unreachable. By threats, by provocations, by insults, by pressure, but also by comfort, by intimacy, by spontaneous joy, by unguarded connection. Musashi mastered the first list. He sacrificed the second. And at the end of his life, writing alone in a cave, producing philosophy and art that would outlive him by centuries, he seemed neither regretful nor satisfied, just clear about what he'd built, what it cost, and what it achieved. He'd made himself untouchable, and he'd spent his entire life unreached. That's not triumph, it's not tragedy. It's simply the accounting of a man who chose one form of mastery and accepted everything that choice excluded. The question isn't whether Musashi was right. The question is whether you're willing to pay what untouchable actually costs. Because the price isn't effort, it's everything that requires you to be moved. Chapter 6. Withdrawal, Reflection, and the True Meaning of Untouchable. In 1643, at age 59, Musashi stopped fighting. Not because he was defeated, not because age had weakened him, not because fear finally caught up. He stopped because the question dueling was designed to answer had been resolved. For nearly 5 decades, Musashi had tested a single hypothesis across dozens of life or death encounters. Can disciplined internal sovereignty overcome superior technique, physical advantage, and social power? The answer, confirmed repeatedly, was yes. So he withdrew. Not into retirement. Musashi had never had a career to retire from, but into a different form of engagement entirely. He walked away from combat because combat had nothing left to teach him. Most people misunderstand what withdrawal meant for Musashi. They assume it signals decline, the fighter who can no longer fight, the warrior past his prime. But Musashi's withdrawal wasn't about capacity. It was about completion. He'd built a discipline, tested it under maximum pressure, proven it worked. And then he did something most masters never do. He documented it. In 1643, Musashi entered Raigondo Cave on Mount Iwato. He brought ink, paper, and decades of operational clarity. He stayed there for 2 years. And he wrote the Book of 5 Rings. The text is strange by literary standards. No narrative arc, no personal anecdotes, no emotional revelation. Just systematic instruction on strategy, timing, perception, and, underlying everything else, the discipline required to remain undisturbed. Musashi wrote it at the end of his life, because only then could he see the complete structure of what he'd built. In combat, the discipline had been survival. In withdrawal, it became transferable knowledge. But here's what's striking about how Musashi taught. He had no formal students. He didn't establish a school. He didn't create a lineage. He wrote the book and left it for whoever found it useful. This wasn't modesty. It was consistency. Musashi had spent his life refusing to let external conditions, including other people's expectations, govern his internal state. He wasn't going to start building a legacy that required him to care about reputation, succession, or institutional preservation. He'd codified the discipline, made it accessible. What people did with it was irrelevant to him. That detachment, even from his own teaching, reveals the final evolution of what untouchable meant. Early in his life, untouchable meant survival. The discipline kept him alive when disturbance meant death. Midlife, untouchable meant dominance. The discipline created asymmetric advantage in combat, but in withdrawal, untouchable transformed into something else entirely. Internal sovereignty, not invulnerability. Musashi could still be killed by disease, accident, or a blade he didn't see coming. Not fearlessness. He still experienced the full range of human sensation, pain, hunger, cold, awareness of mortality, not emotional numbness. He still registered insult, provocation, pressure. The difference was this: none of those external conditions had authority over his decisions. He felt them. He observed them. He integrated the information they provided. But they didn't govern him. That's what his first rule actually protected: the capacity to decide based on strategy rather than reaction. Most people's internal state is set by whatever just happened to them. Someone insults them, they become angry. Someone threatens them, they become afraid. Circumstances improve, they become confident. Circumstances deteriorate, they become anxious. Their effectiveness is entirely dependent on conditions staying favorable. Musashi's discipline reversed that dependency. His effectiveness remained constant because it was internally sourced, not externally triggered. And in his final years, that discipline no longer required combat to prove itself. He could sit in a cave, alone, writing philosophy, and remain exactly as undisturbed as he'd been facing a blade. Because Untouchable was never about winning fights. It was about immunity to manipulation. Immune to provocation, you can't be baited into tactical mistakes. Immune to flattery, you can't be compromised through ego. Immune to pressure, you can't be rushed into poor decisions. Immune to desperation, you can't be forced into positions of weakness. This is why Musashi's first rule underlies every other principle in the Book of Five Rings. He teaches timing, positioning, perception, adaptability, all essential skills. But every single one collapses if your internal state can be destabilized by external conditions. Perfect technique executed by a disturbed mind becomes ineffective technique. Brilliant strategy implemented by someone reacting emotionally becomes tactical failure. The foundation isn't skill, it's the discipline to remain operationally stable regardless of circumstances. Without that foundation, nothing else holds. Musashi understood this completely by the time he entered the cave. He'd watched skilled fighters lose because anger made them predictable. He'd seen trained swordsmen die because fear disrupted their timing. He'd observed talented warriors defeated by their own reactions. And he'd survived not because he was more talented, but because he'd built something they hadn't. A mental architecture that prevented external conditions from having governance over internal decisions. That architecture is what he left behind in his writing. Not as philosophy, not as mysticism, not as motivational content, as operational instruction. If you want effectiveness to survive pressure, this is how. If you want decisions to remain strategic under chaos, this is the discipline. If you want to become untouchable, build immunity to external control. Musashi died in 1645, 2 years after finishing the manuscript. He was 61 years old. Alone in the cave, no family present, no disciples. Mourning. No institutional legacy to preserve his name. Just a completed body of work and a life that had tested every principle it contained. In his final written words, Musashi makes no grand claims. He doesn't promise happiness. He doesn't guarantee success. He doesn't suggest his path is for everyone. He simply states, "I have practiced the way of strategy as a warrior for many years. I have tested it in duels and on battlefields. This is what works. Study it if you find it useful." No romanticism, no self-aggrandizement, no myth-making. Just documentation from someone who had answered his own question and was ready to die. And in that final clarity, the true meaning of untouchable becomes visible. It's not about being stronger than external threats. It's about being ungoverned by them. Not immune to pain, aware of pain but not ruled by it. Not immune to pressure, feeling pressure but not controlled by it. Not immune to chaos, experiencing chaos but not destabilized by it. Musashi built a life where his internal state remained his own property. No opponent could take it. No circumstance could override it. No provocation could hijack it. That's what untouchable meant. And that's what his first rule protects. Your capacity to remain internally sovereign regardless of what the external world does. Which brings us to the only question that matters. Not whether Musashi's path was right. Not whether his trade-offs were worth it. Not whether you should replicate his discipline. But this: who controls your internal state right now? When someone insults you, who decides how you feel, you or them? When circumstances deteriorate, who determines your effectiveness, you or the situation? When pressure increases, who governs your decisions, you or the urgency? Musashi spent 60 years making sure the answer was always the same. He did. Not because he was naturally strong, not because he was emotionally invulnerable, not because he didn't feel what everyone else feels, but because he'd built a discipline that prevented external conditions from having authority over internal decisions. That discipline made him untouchable, not unbeatable, not invincible, not immune to consequence, just ungoverned by anything outside himself. And in the end, that was the only form of control that actually mattered, because everything else, skill, strength, strategy, circumstance, fluctuates. But if your internal state remains under your governance, effectiveness survives every fluctuation. Musashi proved that across more than 60 duels, and then he withdrew, wrote it down, and died, leaving one question for anyone who reads his work. Will you let external conditions govern you, or will you govern yourself? Everything else is just technique.